Right, so I'm assuming that everyone can see the first screen. Is that right, Mark?
We can, yeah, I can see that.
All right, good evening, everybody, and I hope everyone's safe and well this evening in the storm. My name's Chris Wynne. I'm the Senior Reserve Manager for the North Wales Wildlife Trust, and tonight I'm just going to tell you a little about our Goch Nature Reserve, but focus from the point of view of one of the particular species that inhabits the site. And how we manage the site and how it benefits it, and how it benefits a whole range of other wildlife. For some reason. Oh, there you go. Okay. So just before we sort of get into the talk, I thought I'd start off with perhaps a little bit of poetry. As I'm sure if you could sort of have a quick look at the poem on the left-hand side there, there's a poem by Wordsworth, written at the turn of the 18th and 19th century. I think 1802 it was written, and it tells the story of a walk upon the mountains above his home in the Lake District, and as the walk goes on, his mood darkens, and he's just feeling a bit sort of dejected and a bit sad at the thought of the world and what's going on in the world. But then as the poem goes on, his mood lifts following an encounter with somebody upon the moors, a man who's working hard and spent his whole life working upon the moors. And I'll come on to tell you a little bit more about this man later on and how it fits into the story I'm about to tell you. So Goch Nature Reserve on Anglesey, not far from Goch. Its history as a nature reserve is tied up with the history of the Wildlife Trust. It was the first reserve that the Wildlife Trust obtained, or perhaps it would be truer to say that the reserve obtained the Wildlife Trust, because the trust was set up after Goch was bought by the forerunner of the Royal Society for the Wildlife Trust, and this is back in 1963. At that time, the reserve was about 35-40 hectares, and it's now in the region of 100 hectares, so it's considerably bigger than what it was at that point. So the title of my talk tonight, it's called Goch, but it was a subtitled "Quacks, Storms and Presenters," and I should explain a little bit about what this means as I go through the talk. But it won't be the quacks, as in this lovely picture of a mallard taken by Henry Cook. It'll be a different sort of quack. So as I said, I'm going to look at this internationally important wetland from the point of view of one of its more unusual inhabitants. I think this is a good opportunity just to mention some of the key organisations who fund our work at Goch. Natural Resources Wales funded us for many, many years through management agreements, and for the last couple of years we've been funded by the Landfill Disposal Tax Community Scheme, which has not only helped with habitat management but also with a range of engagement work which we've been able to carry on despite the COVID pandemic. So Goch, so you can see it on the screen here, it's this area in this image. It's a very shallow valley. That's about 3/4 of the reserve you can see there. The rest of it is down here, and if you know the site, you will have seen the lake at the southern end down here, and Bringolai Cottage at this end. So just how important is this large wetland? Well, it's globally important in that it's been identified as a Ramsar site. That's to do with the wildfowl present on the site, but it's also recognised at a European level as a special area of conservation. In the UK, it's designated as a site of special scientific interest, and of course it's a Wildlife Trust Nature Reserve. I think all those designations speak volume about just how important a site like this is in a countryside that is devoid of wildlife. And if you've been hearing the news recently with COP26, and they've been talking about how lacking in wildlife the UK is, the worst in Europe. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this, alongside all these designations, it's just a nice place to be. It's a nice place to go and see wildlife and just to be outside and enjoy being outside and close to nature. So although you could broadly describe it as a wetland, there are all sorts of different sorts of wetlands that occur and around the edges of the site, away from the peat. We do get sort of areas of marshy grassland that are inundated in the winter and small streams. And you can see here a small area of wetland with some nice marsh marigold in the front, one of the early spring flowers that you can see dotted around the reserve. But there's also the large lake, Llyn, which isn't spectacular for wildfowl, but you can see nice flocks of widgeon and the occasional teal at this time of year, particularly if you walk around sort of the Ridland Valley part of the reserve, which is over here. So this picture was taken sometime in the summer. You can see at the end of summer see a tractor there harvesting in the hay. And the wetland itself out on the fen is quite varied, although it all looks the same when you look down on it from Bringolai. There are areas of open water, and importantly, most of these are seasonal. As you can see, that this is one of the fire breaks that we cut across the reserve that is completely flooded during after some high rainfall. Then you get areas of cotton grass, and these tend to be around the edge of the reserve as well. And then perhaps most importantly, within the fen itself, it is incredibly diverse. Although it looks very uniform, there are areas of sort of shallow water and very sparse vegetation, which is one of the reasons that makes the site so unique, with a tremendous range of wildlife associated with some of these ponds. And on the edge of the site as well, you get these areas where the water is actually slowly trickling through the peat. And again, these are also very diverse. And if you look closely at this image, you can see there's not a lot of plant material here. There's all these little bits of mud, little bits of oozing peat, which are all fantastic for invertebrates in particular. So that's what the habitat looks like. But if you think about some of the wildlife we get around the reserve now in particular, and the site is incredibly diverse. With otters on the sites, and oops, sorry about that. Barn owls are just one of the more spectacular birds, several species of newt, but the site is really, really important for its invertebrates. Everything from this tiny sort of jumping size spider, which is only a few millimeters across, which lives out in the reed beds, to numerous species of hoverfly. And of course, the site is really well known for its wildflowers, and in particular its orchids. Here is one of the more well known and rarest of the orchids we get on the reserve. Now is the narrow-leafed marsh orchid. And in thinking about this plant, we also think about some of the people from the Wildlife Trust who have gone before us, and in particular R.H. Roberts, Dick Roberts, the late Dick Roberts, who was one of the people who really discovered Goch, along with Prof. Lacey back in the late 50s, who sort of discovered. Everyone knew it was there, but sort of realised how important it was for its wildlife, and was one of the key players in actually getting the site protected. And despite the fact that it's been a nature reserve now for almost 60 years, there are still things that turn up from time to time that surprise us. This frog orchid, or several of them actually, were discovered a few years ago in an area of the reserve that had been grazed, and they were present for a few years and then disappeared again, partly perhaps to do with sort of changing water levels, but a really nice surprise, and one of those things that you can see around the reserve if you look. And alongside that, you get things like marsh helleborine that sort of come and go from different parts of the reserve as well. But let's go back to sort of these small open pools and very sparsely vegetated areas to get to the real sort of a key part of the talk now. So these areas are just quite interesting. There's a range of wildflowers and a range of plants in there. But if you look closely down into the water and you stomp about a bit and you splash about a bit, you can see several sort of quite interesting invertebrates. And this is one of them, although not this the main focus of my talk. This is a horse leech. It's one of the bigger leeches in the UK, one of the 16 species, and quite nice if you like sort of green and black, and quite nicely marked there on the underside. But if you splash around a little bit more and keep wiggling your feet about, you're quite likely to see one of these. So this is a medicinal leech, and altogether a more handsome beech when compared to a horse leech. These lovely markings that run along the body, sort of oranges, and sometimes you can make out blues, or in this particular photograph you can't see that very well. And says it with suckers at both ends, it can attach itself to things, and a nice set of mouth parts at the front end. So these will swim through the water towards you, looking out for some prey. And often how you first encounter them is attached to your welly. So you can just about make out one here. And what they're looking for is something to feed on. Oops, sorry about that. They do feed mainly on mammals, but they also are known to feed on amphibians, in particular frogs and toads, and they will feed on fish and waterfowl as well. And as I mentioned, these sort of key distinguishing features are some of the stripes and the colours on the surface of the leech. And like I said, it's one of the 16 species in the UK. And the pond I was showing you earlier, the pools, is typical of the sort of substrate that it likes. The water here can warm up quite quickly in the summer, and it will start to become active when the water temperature gets above about sort of 10 degrees, 12 degrees. And they have a very restricted distribution around the UK. See, there's several sites in Anglesey. I think it's about six, well, it's about 9 sites historically, but now about 6 sites currently on Anglesey. And then there's a few other sites dotted around England, in particular, and the south of Wales. Some of the sites, particularly when you get down into the southeast of England, you're looking at areas rather than a particular site. So places like the Romney Marshes and Dungeness, where they occupy numerous pools around one particular area. So because of this very restricted distribution, it is protected under various legislation. So it's protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, alongside some European legislation as well. And this partly reflects the big declines that it's been subjected to in the sort of for the last 50 years or more. So there are several factors in the decline, and here again just a little quote from the poem I mentioned earlier. Wordsworth, when he's out on his walk, the person he encounters is a leech gatherer, an old man working up on the moors looking for leeches. And even then, back in the early years of the 19th century, it was difficult to find them. One of the key reasons, as I'm sure everyone can imagine, is the loss of wetland habitat through agricultural change. And this is sort of even now it's still happening, and small sites are being lost and destroyed through agricultural change and drainage. But one of the key reasons for the loss and the decline in the species was its use in bloodletting, and this has been something that's been known for since the well, for 2,000 years or more. There's history of it, and although we might think of it as a sort of a fairly medieval sort of practice, the use of leeches to cure all manner of ailments, it reached its sort of peak in the mid years of the 19th century, when there was thousands of the leeches were collected and used to treat all manner of diseases and ailments around the country, sort of, and hence the quacks of the title, really. This is what I'm talking about. So quack doctors who were using leeches for bloodletting. But now leeches are still used in medicine, in particular in surgery, where there's issues to do with clotting and blood collecting as a result of either open wounds or serious bruising. But it's worth thinking about what makes the leech so important for medicine, and what are some of the factors that make it such a good organism when it comes to feeding on blood and feeding on other animals. So the first thing, and as I sort of touched on earlier on, in terms of how you can actually look for them, it's very sensitive to disturbances in the water. So as either you or an animal or a frog or even a cow, for example, are sort of splashing through the water, you sense a little waves to the water, and the leech can detect those. And those it's those waves that it first uses to detect what's going on around it, and it will home in on those waves. And when as it gets closer, it's actually got chemoreceptors that will help it sort of lock in on its target, so to speak. But once it does, at its sort of anterior end, has quite a potent mouth arrangement with 3 jaws and lots of teeth, so it can bite and latch on to its prey. And once it does, it can eat quite a substantial meal, 6 to 9 times its weight. So that's quite a hefty meal for a small animal. And you sort of think of something maybe something like eating a whole cow in one go or something like that is the equivalent really in terms of weight or perhaps volume. And that meal will usually last it for several months. And the reason it can last several months is it's the antibiotics and the anticoagulants that it has in its gut. It has a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in its gut, and that one meal can be good enough to see it through a whole summer. And if you can get more than one meal, it's more likely to breed in that year. Medicinal leeches live up to about 4 years, depending on how well they can feed, but it's not until they're about 2 years old that they will lay a cocoon. And if they can get a good meal early in the year, it will mean that they're more likely to lay a cocoon. So what is a cocoon? What does it look like? So a cocoon is what they lay their eggs in. So the one at the top is an egg cocoon from a horse leech, and the larger one at the bottom. So this is about 1/2 centimetre across the big squares there, and so this larger one is the medicinal leech cocoon, and they often lay these just above the waterline. So for example, they can use a nest, particularly something like a coot, and they have been found in coot nests, but even in sort of a debris that's been washed around the wetland during high water level, they will lay this cocoon. And this is one of the things that you can look for alongside the leeches when you're out sort of searching for them or surveying for them. And both myself and the Wildlife Trust and other organisations have carried out surveys of some of the sites on Anglesey and looking for both adult leeches. You can see there's some in this container here which have been collected in the net, but you can also look for the cocoons. The techniques for surveying are quite straightforward. There are 2 techniques. There's the old school technique, which is basically you stand in with your wellies and you splash around a bit, and as I've mentioned, the leeches will soon, if they're there, will soon sort of track you down and come looking, and as long as you haven't stirred up the mud too much, they will soon appear in the water and you can sort of count them as they come towards you. A more modern and newfangled techniques is the use of one of these things here called a net, a fishing net, which means you can just splash around with the net. You don't even need to go in with your wellies, and when you see them, you can then catch them and identify them properly, as they can look quite dark when they're in the water and almost look more like a horse leech. So it means you can distinguish between the 2 species a lot more easily if you get them out of the water. So again, if we think back to Wordsworth's poem, he actually refers to this technique in his poem, and stirred with his staff, and fixedly did look upon the muddy water which he conned. Never quite thought of it as conning the water, but that's basically what you do. You're splashing around and you con the leeches into coming towards you. And although this isn't perhaps as spectacular as Sir David Attenborough and his apes, it does make for quite exciting television. The excitement of the chase and trying to catch them. And a few years ago, I was lucky enough to be on Countryfile doing just that, and lots of people saw it, and I was quite surprised how many people did see that particular episode, and even featuring the highlights of the Countryfile for that year as well at the end of the year, which was quite a surprise. Right, so that's a little bit about leeches, but So how do we manage the site for them? What is it that we're doing at Goch that helps us manage the site and provide the right conditions for the leeches? So basically what we're talking about is how do we create this sort of nice open wetland habitat with lots of open water for them and lots of vegetation where they can hide in, and also lots of prey for them as well. We shouldn't forget that. Of course, one way to do that is with large machinery, and this particular bit of kit, which is called a piston bully, is a specialized machine for cutting fen vegetation and working on peat. And despite its size, so this, the top of it there is easily sort of 10 foot high. Despite its size, its ground pressure is less than you or I sort of standing on the peat, and you might sink a little bit, but this sort of works on the top. So although it's very good at removing the vegetation, you sort of think, well, if we want some pools, we don't want something that's quite so clever. So we have used these in the past, but perhaps even more successful and getting some of the results in a much better way is the use of volunteers and contractors. So here's a nice group of volunteers from the university having a nice day out. And again, there's another picture of some volunteers here, and just to again highlight some of the key funders for this sort of practical management work there. So one of our key tasks is cutting the fen vegetation, and we've started on a program of cutting relatively large blocks and then raking the vegetation off and allowing the vegetation to recover. So across the site it will be now much more diverse structurally, which will be good not only for the leeches but for a range of other things as well. And you can see here the sort of mess that gets made. So these little ponds, which are the sort of small areas of water that the leeches can swim through. But not only good for the leeches, good for a range of other things as well. But alongside the work that's done by the volunteers and the machinery, equally important is the work that can be done by some good grazing animals, and particularly if you've got something hardy, stuff and animals that like a bit of rough grazing, sort of these Scottish Highland cows. And although they're not in this particular picture, we do have some Welsh Highlands as well, and we have some belted Galloways that are grazing the reserve. So at the moment we have a small herd of about 13, and alongside a good grazier, in this case Hilary, who knows her work and knows her animals, we can get some really good results and augment the work done by the volunteers and help keep the site open and the small pools that the leeches love, and also provide a little bit of food for them perhaps. You never know. But let's just go back to some of these small pools, and I've sort of talked about how the leeches do like to sort of move around the pools, and they will move towards you. And one of the things that's been noticed is that the leeches do seem to respond to rainfall, and they will move up in the water when it does start to rain. And it was just this that inspired another poet, also a scientist, and that was Edward Jenner, who some of you might recognise the name as the discoverer of the vaccine for smallpox. And he wrote a small poem in which he referred to leeches moving in the rain, and this struck a chord with another doctor, a man called George Merriweather, who lived near Whitby. And he wondered about this, and at the time, sort of middle years of the 19th century, the Victorians were obsessed with trying to understand what was going on around them. So George got to work thinking about how perhaps he could maybe use the leeches to help tell us something about the weather and understand what was going on with the weather. And so he created this rather spectacular bit of machinery. There's an original illustration on the left. On the right we have a picture of a replica that was built probably in around 1950s for the Great Exhibition, I think it was, in the 1950s. And this goes by the fantastic name of the Tempest Prognosticator. Tempest as in storm, and prognosticator, I suppose, as in prognosis. So how does this work? I can hear everybody asking. And so if you look, so although these are models, these are leeches at the bottom here. And so the leeches, these little jars, would be filled with water. And when it was getting stormy or looking like rain, George Merriweather reckoned that the leeches would start to move up in the bottles as they do in the wild, in the pools. And when they get to the top, they hit a little bit of bone, I think it was, a little bit of metal here. And when they knock that out, that causes a bell to ring up here. And when several leeches do that, you get several bells ringing, and the more bells that ring, the more likely that a storm is on its way. I think it's just amazing. And unfortunately, though, it didn't really take off in the middle years of the 19th century. Other ideas came along that helped us tell the what was happening with the weather a lot more accurately. But I just find this absolutely fascinating. And equally importantly for George, he was quite worried about the leeches. So you see these jars, they're all sort of a clear glass, and the leeches could see each other. So as George sort of said, he didn't want them to get lonely and to be on their own. So the fact that they could see each other, they would all be a lot happier and get on with the job of prognosticating about the weather. But he did find that some of them were better than others, and he actually referred to some of them as quite stupid when it came to forecasting the weather. But that's a little bit of a digression away from the nature reserve and the wetland. So let's get back to thinking about the wetland and thinking about causal rock and some of the other benefits of all this work that we're doing that does have provide great results for the leeches. So if you go back to these pools again, there's a range of other species that do benefit from the work we carry out. One group of species that really like sort of the open pools, and whether they're the small ponds that are created, you know, sort of the size of a welly where it's been squelching around, or a larger pond that's been dug by a machine, and that's Stoneworts. And this is perhaps the easiest of the 7 or 8 species that occur on the reserve to identify. This is called Hedgehog Stonewort. As you can see, it's got lots and lots of little prickles, and it does look like a hedgehog, or it looks like one of those medieval maces as well, so they're quite a fearsome sort of weapon. So there are, as I said, there are 7 or 8 species. The reason I say 7 or 8 is one of them at least sort of comes and goes in terms of its appearance on the reserve, depending on a variety of environmental factors. But this is a really easy one to identify in the field. Some of the others would require a magnifying glass and actually taking back home and looking at them under a microscope even. And often alongside these stoneworts, one of the other species that you can see is Bladderwort, and here you can see the small yellow flowers of Bladderwort. So this species is free growing in the water, so it has no roots. So if you do find it, you can actually take it out of the water, have a good look at it, and put it back in the water, and it will carry on growing. And it's quite nice in the sort of the midsummer. You can see these tiny yellow flowers are sticking up out, little dots sticking up out of the water, particularly along the boardwalk. As you go along the boardwalk, there are some nice patches either side of the boardwalk and on the reserve. And around the edges of these pools, particularly where the cattle might have been grazing, or even volunteers stomping around, the sort of very open peat is really good habitat for this particular species. So this is Butterwort. You can see the sort of the leaves here, sort of very pale green, pressed flat against the peat, and these rather lovely sort of purple lilac flowers. And let's show you one more species that occurs in this similar habitat. I wonder if anyone's noticed the link between the last 3 species that I've shown. It sort of just occurred to me as I was putting the talk together, and they're all insectivorous. So everyone knows sundew and these little sort of sticky glands that catch the insects, but because the nutrient levels are so low in the peat, these plants have adapted in another way to get the nutrients that they need, and they catch and feed on small insects and invertebrates in a number of different ways. But one of the other species that you can often see in these small pools are very early in the year, so at the same time of the year as you might see the marsh marigold is bogbean. You get these lovely sort of almost like bottle brush type flowers sticking out of the water, and you can see sort of behind the sort of the 3 leaves that give the plant its name of bogbean. But these pools are also good for numerous invertebrates, and particular dragonflies, and whether it's the small pools either side of the boardwalk or the larger areas of open water, there are a good dozen or more species that you can see around the reserve. And here on the left is one example of the damselflies, the azure damselfly. It's a very common damselfly around the reserve, but less common, but perhaps even more spectacular, is the golden ring dragonfly. These lovely sort of yellow and black bands around the thorax of the abdomen, sorry, of the insect. It's quite a spectacular insect to see and hear as it hovers around, and you can sort of actually hear it almost like a small, tiny helicopter flying around the wetland as it hawks for prey. But perhaps, you know, one of the things that we shouldn't forget, and it's really important, that all this wildlife, all this fantastic biodiverse environment is great for people to go and see. And you know, the events we have there, the guided walks we have there, are a great opportunity to try and see this wildlife. And throughout the year, there is always something to see. And it's good that if you can look out for events throughout the year. And I know we've just run a couple of swamp secrets events at the end of the summer, and I think they proved quite popular. Before I sort of move on towards the end of the talk, I just thought it struck me that there is a little story to tell around the reserve. And I know some of you who know the reserve will know this area in the middle of the wetland. If you walk along the boardwalk, you come up onto this area of heathland, and I'm sure some of you will know about this stone here, this large millstone. The area around Goch, Brimsheg and that area was very important for millstones in the sort of mid years of the 19th century. They were exporting millstones all around the UK and perhaps even abroad, and there are examples to be seen on Anglesey. But this one's quite interesting, that you can't quite make it out in this corner here, but it's broken. So the stonemason who was working on this nearly got the job finished, and then it got to this point here, and it just cracked, and it took a chunk out of the stone. And as I was putting this talk together, I sort of imagined a story in my mind, that there's this man, this stonemason, you know, perhaps working sometime, you know, around the 1860s on one of the last couple of working quarries who were making these millstones on Anglesey. The industry was past its prime, and on the way out, the Corn Laws had been repealed. There was no demand for homegrown flour, no demand for the millstone. So this man was working on here. I imagine it was a man, maybe it wasn't. Been spending many hours on this, and he gets to the point, and he's sort of striking this millstone with his hammer and his chisel, and he manages to whack his thumb or his hand with his hammer, and he sort of mutters a bit in Welsh, but then he sort of thinks he knows what he's got to do. He's got to go off to find someone who could maybe get a leech that he's heard about in the wetland, that could perhaps get rid of this very, very rapidly developing enormous blood clot. And he knows of a midwife who lives nearby who could perhaps do the job for him. So he trudges off across the reserve to find this midwife, and then that midwife leads us into another story, which is perhaps best saved for a walk around the reserve. So I was just quite fascinated by the fact of being able to link the wildlife of this wonderful place to its history and to the people who have lived and worked at Goch for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So just as we come to the end of the talk, I think one of the things that I've touched on is how important wildlife is for us, and I'm sure we're all well aware of this. And even back in the early years of the 19th century, William Wordsworth was more than aware of this in writing this poem, which is known as the Leech Gatherer. And it's a long poem. It's 20 odd stanzas of about sort of 6 or 7 lines in each one. But I sort of told the poem backwards, really, because it does start off with some wonderful opening lines about how nature can make one's heart soar, and whether it's just the raindrops on the grass or the sight of a hare running across the moorland, it can just make you feel so happy and just so glad to be outside. And I think, you know, there's nothing better than that, whether it's taking some people on a walk around the site and just helping them explore it, or just showing people where they can go and the wildlife that they can enjoy on our nature reserves. And I think one final thing, the poem is actually entitled Resolution and Independence. And William Wordsworth refers to the resolution of the peat gatherer who has spent his whole life upon the moors looking for these leeches and working day in, day out, but living an independent life. And it's this that sets William Wordsworth back on track, so to speak, after he sort of goes into this deep despair. And I also think it's something to think about in terms of not only how we approach the biodiversity crisis, but how, as individuals, but how the Wildlife Trust should be approaching it as well, in a resolute and independent way, to making sure that there's a better future for wildlife, for everybody, and for the future as well. So that's all I was going to say, and there's a chance for some questions, and perhaps just before we go into them, I'll finish with a slide here and leave it, just pass over to Mark just to pick up for a few minutes, and then perhaps we'll have a look at some of the questions. I can see there's some chat going on. I'll have a quick look at those, or perhaps while Mark maybe just finishes off, if that's all right, Mark.
That's absolutely fine, Chris. Thank you for that. It was really good, really insightful. Learned a lot. I've got my daughter watching here with me, and she was a bit freaked out by the leech. So, thoroughly enjoyable. It was really, really good. I've got some questions. There's a couple of questions in the chat, but just quickly before we go on to them, as Chris said, just a little reminders for us. So the easiest way to keep in touch with the North Wales Wildlife Trust is to sign up for our free e-newsletter. So the link's on the screen there. Just sign up for our Wild Weekly, and then we'll keep you updated with all the ongoings and things like that within there. Also, if any of you are members of the trust, thank you for your continued support. We couldn't do the work without you, but if anyone else would like to join, the link is there. It costs just £2.50 a month, and that's it. And also, with lots of other ways you can get involved with us. We've got the website up there. Just get, if you want to get involved in volunteering, making a donation, leaving a visit, or just come down to some events. It's just great to have you all on board. And I think that's all I've got to say on that. So do you want to get through some of these questions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I'll just take them in the order which they appeared. So
I'll read them out to you if you want, mate.
That's right. It's all right. I've got them here, so it's no problem. Yeah, I've got the chat up. So the first one was about species of butterflies and moths, of course. Yeah, we've got quite a good list of moths in particular. Over the decades it's been a nature reserve, we have lots of moth trapping has gone on at several locations around the reserve. So we do have a very good list of moths. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any of the names, but it's a very good list. Thinking back into sort of the 80s, and there was lots of work done by Joan Morgan and Hugh Michaelis, who were looking at even the micro moths. So there is a very substantial list of moths, and if you're interested, Paul, I could have a good look at the list and maybe send you some examples from it in terms of moths. But in terms of butterflies, I would normally say, or would have said up until a couple of years ago, we have a good range of butterflies. There's nothing particularly rare. I mean, we do have these small paw birded fritillary, and that's quite abundant some years, particularly upon the heath by Bringolli. In the past, it was one of the known sites for marsh fritillary. If you go back into the 70s and 80s, but there was for a long time we had no records. I think there is still only one site now on Anglesey. But then a couple of years ago, maybe more than that, maybe 3 years ago, we did have 2 records from a very knowledgeable source of sightings at the southern end of the reserve, on 2 different occasions of individual marsh fritillary butterflies. We've not had any since, and we did look subsequent to that for their cocoons and for the caterpillars, but we haven't found any. But it does go to show, like I said earlier on in the talk, you never know. It's worth keeping your eyes out for all sorts of things, including the butterflies. And we can be hopeful if we can manage the habitat right, and it does seem to be in good condition for marsh fritillaries. Maybe they one day will manage to colonize the reserve again. A question from Jake: do any of the carnivorous plants eat leeches? I don't think they're quite big enough to manage one of the leeches. I think so. The sundew and the butterwort tend to catch small flying insects on their sticky leaves, whereas the bladderwort, it catches small aquatic insects and invertebrates in its bladders, which has a little trap door on it that, as the insect sort of swims past, it opens up and then sucks it in and shuts down behind it, and it secretes enzymes that digest the insects. So I don't think any of them would quite manage the leeches, although it's known that leeches can sometimes take sufficient blood from some amphibians to actually kill them. And at that point, that's when horse leeches might feed on the dead amphibians or frogs. Are leeches increasing in numbers, do you know? Well, that is a very, very good question. It's very difficult to estimate the population of leeches. You can only ever sort of sample one particular area. And I think, generally speaking, whenever I've looked for them, I've only ever sort of come across a small number, until this year when I was out sort of doing some survey work, just trying to see how they were doing. And in 2 or 3 ponds, I found over a dozen species, but I do know, not a dozen species, a dozen animals. But in the same area, others have recorded 40 or so, but that's just in one small area of the reserve. So there is a population. As to how large it is, we don't know, and it's very difficult to measure populations of leeches, particularly in this sort of heavily vegetated site like Goch. On some sites where you have larger ponds and larger pools, you can see more leeches at once, so you can get a better idea of the numbers there. I don't think anyone's ever managed to do any capture and recapture experiments with leeches to enable you to estimate populations. You can do that sort of thing with mammals, can't you? And you just snip a little bit off the fur, and then there's lots of equations that you can use to work out how many individuals there are in the population. Next question from Phil, to change the subject completely. Totally off the wall thoughts. In Eastern Europe, elk or moose fill the role of some of that mechanical volunteer vegetation removal. Yeah, they do. So, and that's one thing we're aiming for. One of the reasons to have a hardier breed of cows, such as the Scottish Highlands or even the Welsh Highlands and the Belted Galloways, is they do a really good job of removing the vegetation. And although at the moment we have got this program of cutting the vegetation ourselves, that program is partly because the level of grazing wasn't quite adequate to do the job what it needs to keep the site open. So we're hoping that over a period of maybe sort of 5 to 10 years, and we're sort of a few years into that already, we will get the site to a condition where we can just manage it through grazing. And by adjusting the numbers of animals, we can achieve different effects. And one of the things that's really obvious when you have got even 13 animals on the reserve is how much trampling they can do in a relatively short period of time. Never mind what they eat, the trampling they can do will actually persist from year to year, and that will rot down and create these small pools that are good for dragonflies and things like the bog bean and marsh marigold and some of the other smaller plants that I've been thinking. So there is this hope that we can shift to a regime where we are using more animals more than the people, and that will be a lot more sustainable in the long term. But yeah, that's a very good point. Although whether we might want to introduce something bigger and something perhaps not a native, a wild animal would perhaps require some more substantial fencing than we've got, and that is one of the biggest expenses in terms of looking after Goch, is having adequate fencing to be able to manage the animals properly and keep them where we want them. Yeah, very interesting question. Thanks, Phil. What species benefits from the presence of leeches? I suppose that's like you could almost say that is what's the point of leeches. So species that benefit from the presence of leeches, a very good question. So I would say that leeches occupy a niche in that sort of that whole food web, in the same way that the insectivorous plants do. There is a food source there that they are adapted to and are very efficient at feeding on. But I'm trying to think of a species that benefits. Maybe it's some of the things that might feed on the prey after them. So I mentioned horse leeches will feed on dead amphibians after they've been fed on by medicinal leech, and maybe even other predators. They will feed on young birds, particularly if the cocoons are laid in nests, so they could provide food for other animals there. But perhaps, yeah, here's a line of thought for you. In terms of what species benefits, I'd say us, because they are still used in medicine, as I mentioned, and it was actually in the 70s, I think, when they sort of started to be used in surgery. I think the actual first time they were used in a sort of a medical environment was to help with the reattachment of a young lad's finger in the States, I think. But then they're now used quite regularly in certain types of surgery, and it's because of the chemicals that they use to be able to feed on blood. So not only feed on blood, so one of the key things there is the anticoagulant, which is called hirudin, if I've got the pronunciation right, and that is one of the strongest anticoagulants that we know, whether man-made or natural, and so that's really important. But also the fact that they can keep their blood meal fresh for months while they digest it, and it keeps it and gets them through the summer. That's also really important. So we're only just understanding the chemical processes that allow that to happen. So I would say that, you know, we are one of the species that benefits from the presence of leeches. But that's a good question. There's a comment from Anna, I think. Yes, she's making some Christmas wreaths up at Brindley Cottage on the reserve, and if anyone's interested, you can book online, and you get a chance to go for a walk. I think, is that the end of the question, Steve? Comment from Steve: you must wander around elsewhere other than the spinneys. I recommend Goch, Steve. Yeah, indeed. A question from Mark. So from Mark about so back in the 50s, at around the time sort of Prof Lacey and Dick Roberts were sort of just really getting to understand the site, there was the possibility that the site could have been turned over to be a rubbish dump, and there was a small rubbish dump at the time on the western side of the reserve, but that was abandoned. And I think if you think of what the main rubbish dump on Anglesey is like now, Penheskin, that is the fate that Goch avoided. Okay, so reptiles. So we've got a good range of reptiles on the reserve. We have adders. There's some good populations of adders at various places around the reserve, but also slow worms and common lizards are the three key species around the reserve, and all can be seen sort of around Brindley Cottage end of the reserve in the summer months. Oh, a comment from Sue. Oh wow, excellent. Thanks, Sue. That's really cool. So Sue's saying that she, I don't know if anyone can see the question, everyone can see the questions, that she actually saw the medicinal leeches being used on patients to increase blood flow to surgical and skin graft sites. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, so small pearl bordered still there, small copper, common blue, orange tip, speckled wood. Yeah, so yeah, it's a really good place to see that sort of range of the commoner butterflies, because of the broad range of habitats away from the wetland areas. You know, we've got nice areas of species rich grassland and good hedgerows and the heathland.